flash mob is that? Yeah, sorry.
Was there no anti-Semitic content at the 1915 riot?
I can't find any. Yes, there must have been. Yes, there must have been, but there's no instance that I could find, that I might not have looked at enough newspapers, where Jewish people put up a note saying, we're Jewish, leave us alone, we're not... I think one did. I think there was one instance where it said, we're Jewish, we're not German, leave us alone. But on the whole, I think the Jewish population was not part of the activity. So people who were Germans were Lutherans or Catholics, and they were attacked because people knew they went to church. So they knew the churches, they knew, they did people's hair and all the rest of it. So it wasn't the kosher butcher or anything like that. So no, Jews were actually left alone just for once.
I found myself really taken by one minor little point, and that was the idea that...
Shout.
Sorry. I was fascinated by one minor point, and that was the idea that in England, that you would, the authorities would take a place that had been the site of a riot and make it a garden or a park,
Yes.
I mean, and I'm not sure, I found myself, because I'm American, wondering whether that's a cultural difference or if it's much more of a post-World War II suburban.
No, it's
I
not
live in a mall where, an area where more and more public spaces become
the idea of putting up a park,
and then it's not, because it's private, you can't even say leaflet there or anything like that.
Well, it's all part of that. I mean, if you think of a riot usually happens in a waste space, a space that no one's monitoring. A park is monitored, a park has flowers. People don't tend, it's just psychological, people won't tend to march across a bed of flowers because that's creative. There's something creative about that. So people won't do that. So they'll go along the path. And if they go along the path, they're organised, they're policed already. So, and also if you go to a park, in the old days, 19th century, there would have been nannies pushing their prams and all the rest of it. So it would completely change the atmosphere. It would create an atmosphere of gentility. And that atmosphere of gentility would then encourage people to build houses around which were more gentrified. So you completely change the idea of an area. So almost everywhere, if you look at just about anywhere that's got a good public park, there was probably something notorious happened on it.
Yeah, I'm still wondering how much of that is, again, cultural differences versus time, because I just know, how can I put this? Where I'm from, I think parks are seen as vaguely suspicious. That's where drug dealers are. That's where kids go and buy drugs.
Remember, we're talking about the Victorian period. We're talking about the Victorian period where parks were the epitome of civil... as I say, 19th century, a park was the absolute epitome of the idea of civil order and of civil pride. So Joseph Chamberlain, for instance, in Birmingham, brings in this idea of having civic pride. His revolution is going to be the idea of having civic pride in everything, rather than this. So Manchester's destroying everything at this point. But Joe Chamberlain comes in and says, no, we want to empower everybody by having civic pride. Big buildings, art galleries, public spaces you can walk and feel safe in, things like that. Then you'd have the band coming, so you have the army band or whatever. So in Britain, and I think in the 19th century in America too, these would have been places of great pride. They've degenerated now, of course.
Just want to put the Play of riots, 9 months after the riots in Cable Street riots, where they did not pass, the BUF did very well in the LCC elections.
Oh yes.
If the BPR, so like the BNP now, the GLA, the BUF would definitely have got seats on the LCC if they're BNPR. And the point is that the idea is the fascists were defeated in the East End. Well, excuse me.
They moved somewhere else.
No. Excuse me. They got in May 1987 BLCC election. They got 24% Bethnal Green and 21% in Mile End.
Well, of course, interesting enough, of course, one of the great places to completely contradict what I just said, one of the great centres of BUF activity was Victoria Park. So the parks become places of public order, but then they can be recolonised if there's enough grass. You've got to get rid of the grass, because people will sit on grass, they'll stand up around grass. You've got to get rid of anything that's not just simply flat. So the great place for that is Hyde Park, it's just flat. So they had the Garibaldi riots in there, people supporting Garibaldi, and they barricaded that. They put up barricades and all sorts of things. It was real war for about 3 days in the Garibaldi riots. But parks are fascinating places, as are town squares, as are streets. These geographical spaces where people run and do things. And so, for instance, the obvious thing is, think of Grosvenor Square. Look at how they defended those huge flower pots they put in front of Grosvenor Square as soon as Grosvenor Square finished. If you know Park Lane, if you remember, you're old as me, you remember Park Lane, it never used to have barriers down the middle. Those barriers were put down precisely after the 1968 riots. Because then you couldn't cross the road. You couldn't run across the road.
The Rotten Riot, the Rotten Row riots.
Rotten Row riots, yeah.
I mean, that's really famous, apart from the fact that, I mean, Uncle Carl turned around and said, this is the first day of the English Revolution, which I thought, rather optimistic, to say the least. But the fact that, I mean, the riots were taken because who was actually using the space?
Exactly. It's how you colonise the space. It's how you make use of the space that's available. And what the authorities try to do the whole time is close the space down, close it down, close it down, close it down. But of course they just squeezes someone somewhere else. So they built Trafalgar Square, which is a nice space. They think, oh, we're going to put up a monument to a war hero and all the rest of it. Immediately, the very first thing while they're building Nelson's Column is the SDP and all those people, the William Morrises and all the rest of it turn up in the square and say, we're not going to put up with taxation, or we're not going to put up with something. And they have to bring in the Coldstream Guards, 2 battalions of the Coldstream Guards, which is about 1,200 men to defend the place.
They had to stop the executions, though.
Country?
They had to stop the executions. I mean, Charing Cross was actually a site for
That's right.
various political executions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes, sorry, man at the back.
Yeah.
Behind you, I think.
Yeah. Oh yeah, just to say, there was a reference earlier on to people using the fact that surveillance is used against us, against them.
Yes.
I can think of one instance where it happened some years ago in times more primitive technology, when Committee of 100 or or maybe direct action, part of the more direct action end of the nuclear disarmament movement, knew that there was a government bunker, a war bunker in a particular town, had no idea where it was. So they all organised amongst themselves, say we're going to demonstrate outside the bunker in whatever town it was, and then turned up in the day to see where the line of police was.
Yes.
And and which so clearly, it is possible to use.
It is possible. Yeah. I mean, what I've found essentially is that if you're having a riot, British people, the only riot where British people have ever taken weapons in recent history, not really in living history anymore, but in recent history, was Cable Street, where they took marble, or Grosvenor Square also, where they took marbles to throw under the feet of the horses. But people don't tend to walk around with those sorts of weapons or stones or anything anymore. So consequently, they're completely, literally armless against the police. So there's nothing they can do but run away. There's nothing you can do unless you're going to be kettled, in which case you're stuck with the police staring at you. The police always have the upper hand unless the police are broken up. And in fact, the police only lose the upper hand when they're the ones doing the violence, and that's why they've lost the respect they had recently. So it's a very difficult